Hi there, welcome to my latest edition of my 10-minute moan. This one, bit bizarre, is about some real skullduggery that Nicola Sturgeon appears to get herself involved in years ago. And for some bizarre reason, although it was covered in the mainstream media at the time and a lot of online chatter about it, I completely missed it. And I think it's fair to assume that if I've missed it, maybe plenty of other people have missed it as well. So I want to tell you this story. There's a few, back in time to get the full details of it about Nicola Sturgeon and her. Probably gives you a good insight into her morals, if I'm perfectly honest with you. So this story revolves around a convicted fraudster, twice convicted fraudster, who Nicola Sturgeon happily provided a character reference for and pleaded for no custodial sentencing of this twice convicted fraudster. Now, the story, as I said, I've used many resources to gather information on this, a lot of mainstream coverage on it, but the sort of biggest amount of information I've got was from a website, carltonjock.com. And Carlton Jock is a blogger who describes himself in his bio as an independence supporter of 65 plus years and someone who hates the English colonial rule. So I think it's fair to say that Carlton Jock and myself are very different spectrums of different ends of the political spectrum in Scotland. Yet both of us find this whole thing a bit stinky, to be perfectly honest with you. So I'm going to go through a few of the finer details of this in chronological order. So please bear with me, as I go through some quite infinite detail, and then I'll give you my sort of summary of it and personal feelings of it at the end. So it goes back to a convicted fraudster called Abdul Rauf. I do apologise, his surname is Rauf, and I'm unsure how to pronounce it. So back in 1994, this is where the story starts. Abdul leased from Post Office Counters Limited, a building in Tollcross Post Office in Edinburgh, not Tollcross, Glasgow, and he paid £9,200 per annum for that and operated it as a post office. He was jailed 3 years later for 4 years, convicted for 4 years, for forging signatures and cashing in 779 Department of Social Security payment orders to the value of £58,000. That was back in 1996. Put a bit of inflation on that, it's a serious amount of money. And these crimes were committed between June 93 and July 94, so he was at it for just over a year. And he did so, he was forging signatures on payment orders and cashing them in, I would imagine, at his own post office, which would make the crime a wee bit easier for him. Now, he used the cash that he got from these fraudulent activities. He bought, first of all, a flat in Dalkeith Road in Edinburgh for £28,000 back in 1996. That, by the time 2010 came along, the last valuation on it showed £200,000. And he created an income of over £10,000 per annum from that property. That's key. You need to remember that he had this property he was getting an income from, because that comes back into the story later on. He also at the time purchased a large house in Glasgow near Maxwell Park for £93,000. That, fast forward to 2022, was last valued at £850,000. Serious bit of postcode there. He then bought a second flat, and the third property in total, back in Tollcross in Edinburgh, near his post office. He bought that for £14,000 back in 1994, but he later sold it on to his wife in 1998 for £43,000. Unclear what she done with it, whether she rented it out or sold it. And when he was getting jailed the first time, Lord Sutherland, when he was sentencing him for 4 years, said this case discloses a very serious breach of trust, which appears to have been carried on quite deliberately for a period over a year and involved a very substantial amount of money, which is no wrong. He was then convicted in 2008 on fraud charges for the second time, claiming £80,000 of income support from the Department of Work and Pensions. The whole time he was doing this, he was receiving, remember I told you to remember the flat? This was while he was receiving his £10,000 annual rent for the property in Edinburgh, which he failed to declare. In his defence, now this is cracking because this reminds you of somebody else I'm going to talk about soon, he told the social security investigators that ownership of the flat had slipped his mind. Sounds like Miss Sturgeon, doesn't it? And she's asked some serious questions. So he forgot basically that he had this flat when he was taking his income support, £80,000 worth of income support, I may add. Then in February 2010, aware that the custodial sentence for the benefit fraud would be the outcome of his trial, the Scotland's Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, wrote a letter of support for Abdul Rauf. Now, Donald Finlay was his QC at the time, obviously a KC now. He produced this letter in support from Nicola Sturgeon in the court. And in it, I will read verbatim, Mr. Rauf has accepted his wrongdoings and has experienced the consequences of it through the effect of his health, the distress caused to his family, and the impact on his standing in the community. He has already paid £27,000 of the outstanding balance to the Department of Work and Pensions and will settle the remainder by selling property. He and his wife are anxious that the custodial sentence may be imposed by the court and of the effect this will have on his health and the impact on his family life. I would appeal to the court to take the points raised here into account and consider alternatives to a custodial sentence, which basically that last sentence is saying, gone in ho, send him to jail. The Sheriff Alan Mackenzie, who is sentencing him, told Rauf that his jail term was at the forefront of his mind, and he said he would defer sentence for 3 months and released him on bail. He said, I'll take into account all that's been said on your behalf, including a letter from a member of the Scottish Parliament. So, he then comes back and he got sentenced. Now, fast forward February 2010, Holyrood castigates Sturgeon. Now, there was calls then from Billy Aitken, who's a Conservative Justice spokesman. He had a right go, saying she was duty bound as a constituency to make reasonable presentations. She's claimed that she was, as a constituency MSP, she had to do this, right? Alex Salmon said this is not a matter connected to her role as a Deputy First Minister. But let me be absolutely clear, I absolutely back her. I'm struggling with this. Billy Aitken, Conservative Justice spokesman, said it's extraordinary to describe a second conviction for fraud as a mistake. Fair comment, I think. Either she didn't care about his previous convictions or she didn't check. Either would be unbelievable and a grave lapse of judgment, of course it would. And you can imagine the judge receiving a letter for the deputy leader of the party that was in power in Scotland at the time, pleading for this guy not to be put in jail. And if you think about it, as Scotland in a whole, she was second in charge of the government. She was deputy leader of the SNP. There's only one person higher up in the West Scottish government, and that's the First Minister. But Alex Salmon thinks it's all right. It's nothing to do with her job as a deputy leader of the Parliament at the time. Absolutely bizarre. And the Scottish Labour leader at the time, Ian Gray, the facts of this case are they appeared and Nicola Sturgeon made such an appalling error of judgment she must resign. Don't think he was the only one to call, and that's just some of the stuff that I picked up in the mainstream media. So that's where we're at. It gets more bizarre. Rauf himself was describing Nicola Sturgeon as heavily involved in his community in Glasgow. Now, Hansa Malik, a senior councillor, said he didn't know of him or any of his work. And Bashir Mann, who's a community leader, said he'd no knowledge of Rauf at all. And a spokesman for this central mosque said, which is the biggest in Scotland, said he didn't worship there and had not been to their Islamic centre, and also the 3 nearest mosques to where he lived in Portshields at the time. I had no recollection of who this man was. Yet the Deputy First Minister of Scotland saying how terrible it'd be for the community if he went to jail. He wasn't involved with the community at all. The 16th of February 10, there was an extraordinary development. It was disclosed that Sturgeon's plea to the sheriff on behalf of Abdul Rauf was dated the day after businessman Khalid Javid had paid £2,000 for a meal in the MSP's restaurant at Hollywood with Nicola Sturgeon, Deputy First Minister. The auction raised money for Osama Saeed. This is Hamza Yusuf's cousin. We've covered him slightly in a previous video. He was an SNP minister candidate in Glasgow Central at the time, so he was obviously doing some fundraising. And part of it looks like this Khalid Javid paid £2,000 to have his lunch with Nicola Sturgeon in the restaurant at Holyrood. 24 hours later, Nicola Sturgeon writes this letter for a person who she has no knowledge of previous to this. Also, the man in question, he stated that he didn't know Sturgeon, had never met Sturgeon. Yet Sturgeon wrote a letter as a character witness for him to try and get him away with serving prison time for the second guilty verdict he had for committing fraud. Sturgeon didn't know. But it's 24 hours before it, Sturgeon did. Now, I don't know if these two things are linked. I have no way to back that up. What I will say, though, Calton Jock does a lot of investigating, but if you look through his website, he seems to be quite competent at it. Now, he's not saying they're connected either. What he's saying is there's two facts. Well, make your own mind up without having more knowledge about this meeting with the man that paid £2,000 to have his lunch with Nicola Sturgeon and what actually happened. I probably couldn't comment on that either. But it is another sort of seedy connection between Osama Saeed, who's Hamza Yusuf's cousin, Hamza Yusuf himself, and Nicola Sturgeon. It's just as mad as a bag of cats, isn't it? Labour business manager Paul Martin last night, obviously back in 2010, said this latest revelation adds to the suspicion that there's more to this story. Nicola Sturgeon has failed to answer questions as to why she took up this man's case in the way she did. She has also failed to tell us who introduced her to Mr. Rauf, because they didn't know each other. Bizarrely enough, I'll find it down here. Rauf said in a statement to the press later that he did not know Sturgeon, and he had not asked her to intervene in his behalf with a letter to the court. Here's the question, why then? How did it happen and why? And bizarrely, in a statement a few weeks later, Nicola Sturgeon, who was the deputy leader at the time but was also the health minister, said, sorry, she made some mistakes, covered that. And there's another, she was a health, May 2010, 4 months after she pleaded with a sheriff not to send convicted benefits conman Abdul Rauf to prison. She said this in her role as the health secretary: anyone contemplating fraud against the NHS should be aware that they will be caught. And if they are caught, they will have to face the consequences of their fraudulent activities. They will have to face the consequences of their fraudulent activities. Fraudsters in any walk of life are opportunistic, tend to be fairly entrepreneurial, and will take the opportunity to exploit any weakness in the organisations they target. Let me be clear today about what is a zero tolerance approach to fraud and to fraudsters. Fraud perpetrated against the NHS is, in my view, a fraud perpetrated against each and every one of us. That is why it is so important to combat it. So it does make sense for all of us, in our own ways and in our own roles, to act as counter-fraud champions. There you are. This is 4 months after she wrote a letter to a judge for a man who'd been convicted twice of fraud and who she'd never met. She had miraculously no relationship with, and who claims he never asked her to write a letter. It's absolutely stinking, isn't it? And it just shows you what I've said for a long time, that the SNP hold others to far higher standards than themselves. The fact that this woman survived this in her role as the deputy, the fact that nobody ever bothered after 2010 trying to get to the bottom of how this came about. This is a woman that champions transparency and openness and honesty, apart from when she's involved. Because she knows why she wrote that letter. She would know who made her aware of this case that she felt in her role as a deputy leader of the Scottish Parliament to write to a judge and ask him not to sentence this man to prison. Yet, until this day, and back, 14 years ago, she refused to answer that question. The woman is incapable of lying straight in bed. She is intolerable. She's one of the worst types of people that you'll ever come across. Someone who demands of others, which they don't demand from themselves. If she was squeaky clean and above any question of her integrity, then, I could allow her to hold others in high regard. This is a woman who's currently under investigation, under the Branchform investigation, that I'm not going to comment on right now, and is adamant at all times that she's faultless in all her business dealings, sits in front of committees and says, I do not recall, I cannot remember, I don't have the ability to recall that, on numerous occasions. She hides more than any other politician I've ever seen, yet wants every other politician to be held accountable to her demands. You're a fraud, and I don't mind telling you that. Fraudulent in respect is you try to portray this personality of caring, you don't. Honesty, you couldn't spell the word. Openness, only when it suits you and you demand it of others. And total transparency. I would suggest when you're writing your memoirs and you're doing some studying for it, pick up a dictionary or a thesaurus and look up the word honesty and the word integrity. And you should have done it before you get involved in politics, because you are a shambles. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, give me the thumbs up. If you want to see more, hit the subscribe and the notifications. Leave some comments below. Always enjoy them, especially from the independence people. Some of them get a good conversation with, and some of them are absolute bonkers. I enjoy both equally, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. But most important thing of all, have a great day. Bye now.